Laura is going to introduce our speaker and the topic, and I think most of you know something about the topic already. But I'm glad to see both of them. Virgil and I we were neighbors for a brief time,
Wow.
but living across the hall in the Lamar Tower. But go ahead, Laura. You just take over, please.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you. And I know some folks wanted to be here who couldn't. This is being recorded and will be available. So I am so grateful to be here in the church house. And I can't wait to see those of you who are ready to come back at 11. So that'll be exciting. We have Virgil Fry, as Bill mentioned, with us this morning. And many of you know Virgil. He's proclaimed here at Covenant. He's attended many Sunday services. He's just retired as the executive director of Lifeline Chaplaincy, which you know is just down the street. And through our friendship, Lifeline has been, maybe they would have been anyway, but certainly our friendship helped. Lifeline has been an excellent neighbor to us. And when we were building this building, excuse me, perhaps you'll remember that we met at Lifeline for committee meetings, and we had our children auction here and just all sorts of things. So I'm really grateful for Virgil and for all of that. The one thing you may not know about Virgil is that he has taught and written about and presented on grief. He's also experienced grief. So it's not just a cognitive exercise. So he's a bit of an expert on the subject, and given our COVID months and the number of beloveds we have lost in that time, and just all of our experiences of loss, we're talking about what we could do, how we could respond and be helpful. I wonder if everybody could mute, just like a buzzing happening. If you're not on mute, if you could mute, that would be really helpful. There will be a time for questions. Thanks. That stopped whatever it was. So the deacons decided that we would have this shared education hour that Virgil and I would do. And then there also will be a workshop, which I mentioned last Sunday on Zoom. The new date for that is July 17th. So there'll be a workshop and then a service of remembrance on July 17th from 10 a.m. to noon. And we hope to live stream that. So even if you are not ready to come in person or cannot, there should, we hope, be a way to live stream and then a recording. So that's coming up. So these pandemic days have been full of grief, full of loss and disappointments, large and small. We are all grieving. We as Covenant Church mourn the deaths of Martha Murphy, Margot Hibbler, Ann Pirtle, Mary Lee Burris, Charlene Hooker, Sydney Burris, and Roberta Stokes. Each of these beloveds died while we've been meeting virtually. And then all of us, everyone on the planet, has borne witness to millions of deaths due to coronavirus. 60,000 Texans have died of coronavirus. So while we all experience grief and loss in different ways, there are enough experiences that most people share that it can be helpful to talk about these often shared experiences of grief. Words like stages and steps are often used to describe grief, but Virgil and I agree that they're not very helpful because it makes it sound like you get to finish, like there's a sequence, step 1, step 2, step 3, done. In my experience, that is not how it works, not at all. Grief is not something we finish. So one description that I've found to be helpful is to think about grief as a spiral, something that loops on itself. So you might feel angry here, but you're not done with anger. It's probably going to come back, for example. Another description I use, and you've heard it before, so forgive me, but I'm going to tell you again, is that grief is like being in the ocean. When you first walk into the ocean, when you first experience this loss, the waves hit you again and again and again, and everyone hits you. And you can't jump over them, and they crash into you, and sometimes they send you tumbling into the waves, and water and salt get up your nose. But the further in you get to the ocean, the more able you are to jump the waves, the more able you are to keep your head above the water. The salt is still there, the water is still there, but you can keep, you can go with the waves, you can jump over them. Now, sometimes a wave swamps you. Sometimes out of nowhere, you are taken again under the water and somersaulting and gasping for breath. That is how I have found grief to be. For me, and I think Virgil and I were talking about this too, sometimes I don't recognize grief for what it is. This is especially true for the grieves that are not mourning a death of a loved one. So the losses, for example, that we've all experienced this year, the kids not getting to do any of the things they normally get to do. Those are griefs not just for the kids, but for me. So there have been so many losses. And we've experienced deaths, and we've experienced forced changes we did not want, fear, and the loss of stability. That is a grief. Trips that have had to be canceled, routines that have been shattered, family gatherings that have been moved to Zoom, birthdays celebrated over screens or in backyards 6 feet apart. We've grieved the way we've needed to do church. I've been grateful that we had this way to do church, but it's not been what I would have chosen if we had other options. And I've grieved not being with you together. Okay, so to just bring it home, somewhere around the 1 year mark of meeting virtually, I began to hear a voice, not really audibly, I don't hear voices, but I began to think in my head about a scene from Cars 3. Now, okay, maybe you haven't seen Cars 3, but I would highly recommend it to you. It's a great film. I'm going to tell you about it anyway. So in Cars 3, the race car, Lightning McQueen, is on a racing simulator that he's not quite ready to use. He gets on it and he can't figure out how to do it correctly. So there's this mechanical voice, the simulator voice, hit a wall. You have hit a wall. The troubles escalate and the voice says, you have jumped a barrier. You have hit a wall. You are on fire. Danger, danger. You have crashed. So McQueen finally frees himself from the simulator and he says out loud, I have crashed. So I kept thinking of these words. You have hit a wall. You have hit a wall. Danger, danger. You have crashed. And I even one day said out loud to Grayson and Owen, I have crashed. They were like, what? So the good news is I was able to recognize in myself that if those were the lines playing in my head, that I wasn't okay. Hello, you're not okay. So I called my therapist and I went for extra walks. I added another walk to my already routine of 2 walks. And I started actively trying to be kinder to myself. And I did the things I would tell anybody to do who's grieving. And those things would be get a routine, set up a ritual, a time that you can be just alone, light a candle. And even if it's 5 minutes, that'll give you 5 minutes to do what you need to do. And maybe that's journaling, and maybe that's reading a poem, and maybe that's walking, but give yourself time to grieve. And I did that and it has helped. And I'm glad to tell you that I've not crashed anymore and back up and rolling. So I'm going to turn it over to Virgil, who's got a PowerPoint to share with us.
We hope. What you're talking about, the grief that we've experienced culturally, I was thinking of, I have 2 granddaughters here. They were in the 5th grade and the 8th grade when the pandemic hit. And last year at spring break, when all the kids were supposed to be off for spring break, then go back, and then they weren't. They didn't go back. That's when all the schools went virtual. Both of those were in schools that was their last year in that school. Mm-hmm. And they didn't get to say goodbye to their friends, to their teachers. They didn't get to do the normal things that you would have done at the end of school. And you know, they didn't voice it, but they felt it. You could just sense they missed those connections. There's a grief when things get turned upside down or taken away from us like that. And we don't always call it grief, but in fact, it is a form of grief that's very real. How you have chosen to do worship online, there's a grief in that. You have missed seeing each other eyeball to eyeball. And the times I've watched Laura, she's talked about that in her sermon some, that she's ready to see your faces again and to be together. And it's a loss. How many of us have walked to the front of the grocery store and had to turn around and go back to your car to get a mask? I'm still doing that, or I was until this week. It's like, when do I learn, that this is the normal of now. So I want to just talk about some things that I have gathered through the years as a hospital chaplain, primarily at MD Anderson, as my own academic studies in pastoral ministry, but mostly I've learned through personal experience, which of course is the most effective teacher. My wife of 34 years, Carol, died at age 54, 13 years ago in September. And so I learned then how to be single. I learned all kinds of identities that I had for myself as a husband or partner. All of that went away, and you just have to learn new ways to be, and it takes a long time. I too have a therapist, so I guess it's okay to tell this group. So I don't know.
I bet most people here do.
And part of my therapy, my grief therapy, included learning to acknowledge the grief that came about because of the caregiving I had to do, or chose to do is a better way to put it, the last year and a half of her life. She was on dialysis that we did at home. We made 90 trips to the medical center from Missouri City the last year of her life, the last 9 months, really. It was full-time caregiving, and watching her lose her independence, her vibrancy, her personality changed, over-depended on me, which she was very regretful about, losing a lot of her close friends because they didn't know what to do with her. And in the therapy, I decided I was grieving as much for that year and a half of my life revolving around caregiving as was her death. It didn't lessen the grief over her death, but it just came home to me. I was grieving over that. So people that are in the caregiving mode, if that's any of you, there is a grief that goes with that that's palpable. So all kinds of ways that we don't always talk about grief, but they are. We're going to try to share a screen. Notice I said we.
Mm-hmm.
So if it doesn't work, it's Laura's fault.
That's right.
Okay, and I'm going to do slideshow. Okay. You may get to see this on the left because I'm not
Away
smart.
from the start.
Huh?
Is it? Can you all see just the slide? There we go. Now we're ready.
I love technology. That's actually not true. So these are just some reflections to kind of tease us into the topic. And then if you're able to come to our workshop on the 17th, we'll do about an hour or so of talking about some specifics of grief. And then we'll actually have a reflective service, a quiet service to honor all the griefs that we're sharing. And you as a congregation, certainly with the names that you just mentioned, to be able to call names of them and anyone else.
And right now, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. And
Oh, yeah.
we hope to have some time to answer questions at the end.
Thanks.
So, yes.
That's why it takes two of us to do this. I think sometimes it's helpful just to remember the root words that we use. These three words, grief, bereavement, and mourning, interchangeably, and that's okay. But when you look at where they came from, it really does describe them quite vividly. Grief is actually that sense of being robbed, of having something taken away from you, a sensation that is, if you've ever been robbed, and we all have in some ways, it's very unpleasant. It's not what we want. Bereavement is the internal emotion that we have to being robbed. And then mourning is the coming together, the communal expressions of the bereavement and the grief. Again, we can use those interchangeably, and there's no problem with that. But the last one, I think, is what your class today is about, and maybe the upcoming workshop. You have been actually robbed of the normal ways that you would come together and express your bereavement and to share it as a group, just because you couldn't in person. And so to be able to acknowledge that we need that, we grieve on our own, and it also brings up that we need other people to walk with us through it. So we're going to talk specifically about some things that I think are important that I've learned through the years. I'm still learning. No one likes to talk about death. Everyone needs to. I present a lot of times in churches, or I teach a graduate course at some colleges on crisis. And it's amazing how many people don't even have a will. People that may even be terminally ill that I've met at the hospital, and they've never even talked about doing a basic will, much less the do not resuscitate and all the other things that can go along with it. Why is that? Well, we don't like to talk about it. It becomes too real. I think faith communities ought to be leading the way in helping us acknowledge that death is a part of life. Part of my childhood was spent growing up on a farm, and you learn there the reality of death through animals and plants and people. My kids did not have that. They grew up in the city, and unless it was a pet that died or a close family member, they didn't experience the day-to-day life and death cycles. And so there are some disadvantages to urban living. And yet, what more important topic is there? In November of last year, I was at a retreat at Camp Allen. I was really suffering there. It's just a terrible place to have to do a retreat, but I managed. Yeah. No sympathy. Huh? But my leg was swollen, and it had been for several days. And being a manly man, I kept thinking, well, it's just a deep bruise. I will get over this. And I was trying to walk some of the beautiful trails that are there, and it just kept hurting. And on the way home, I thought, if this is a blood clot, I might want to know that. I'm slow, but eventually it gets to me. So I wound up going to the emergency room that day, thinking they're going to tell me it's a deep bruise. And in fact, it was a blood clot in the calf of my leg. I had a grandfather who died of a stroke at 61. And once I passed 61, I thought I was in the clear. That's wishful thinking. And it was taken care of. I'm still on a blood thinner and will be for a year. But it's very startling when you hear the word blood clot and it's your body that you're talking about, because blood clots, as most of us know, can travel. And when they travel, it's not a good thing. So we get these reminders. If you're almost in a car wreck or in a car wreck, things can happen so quickly that it reminds us that we sometimes just gen along and think things are okay and always will be. And we get these reminders. The 8 deaths that you have had here obviously hits you hard, I would think, in your heart, but also the reality that this is the story of all of us. Tears and laughter, sorrow and joy, God's reminders of the richness of love. Some people, when they are tearful in their grief, get chastised or say you shouldn't cry, or hear words like, she wouldn't want you to cry. She wouldn't want you to be sad. First of all, how do you know that? And second of all, it's the most normal thing. God made the tear ducts for a reason. I'm convinced it's part of our created order. And it's amazing when people get together, the communal thing I was talking about earlier under mourning, there's often a lot of laughter as people begin to recount stories, or you remember when, or you know what I liked about him or her. And both of those are healing expressions, and sorrow and joy are kind of a polarity that go together. And I think we need both. And that to me is why we need times when we can be together. I'm a big believer in memorial services, funeral services, that we need those. We need some sort of ritual that we can be together. And then later we need the reminders, the anniversaries. Laura and I have talked about the months that we were impacted. You with your mother's death, May. Every May, it starts coming up. For me, it's September, even though it's been 13 years. And I think, okay, not this September. I'm not going to go there, which is kind of a silly, manly thing to say to yourself. But it does. It's not the raw grief I had 13 years ago, but the reminders are there. It's just in my conscious. The brain has filed it away, and it's there. And sometimes we're surprised at what pops up. Mm-hmm. I had a lady one time tell me, she was in the grocery store, and she said, I felt like this blue cloud was hanging over me. And she said, "What in the world is going on?" She said, "I could not figure out why I was feeling this sense of loss and depression." And she said, "Oh, it's Bob's birthday." Bob was her husband who had died 14 years ago. And she said, once that came to her, it made sense. So she was remembering, though her conscience wasn't remembering. The brutal reality of death is salved by shared stories of earlier days. Sometimes people would apologize to me for telling Carol's stories after she died. I still enjoy hearing them. They'll say, "You know what I was thinking the other day about Carol," and that does not make me sad. It actually brings a sense of joy that others are also connected with her in ways that are important. So we don't have to protect each other from those stories, and maybe to speak openly. So, grieving is a process, one that takes time and then some more time.
You can click, yeah, that one.
A lot of us, maybe all of us, think that once you get through this salt waves that we're in, that okay, we'll do it, 6 months, maybe a year. If it's a significant loss or a death, it's actually going to always be with us, just not on the same level, perhaps. But I think most of us are surprised at how long it takes to regain your footing. I'm doing a bereavement support group for the Institute of Spirituality and Health online. And there's a lady on there, she said it took her 2 years after losing her husband. He lost him suddenly to a heart attack. 2 years before she finally began to feel like she could think in terms of other than just grief. That was her way. Everybody is unique. Everybody grieves in their own way. And there's no timeline, but as you said, we don't always follow the steps or the stages that we think we're supposed to be in.
And society at large, has no patience for this, right? 3 days of bereavement leave if you're lucky. Well, 3 days is about the time you become aware that this has happened. So
It's true.
Yeah. So this can't be said often enough. And in my mind, there's this idea that we get over something. We don't. We incorporate it. We keep moving. We have a rich, full, beautiful life, and the grief stays. Love never dies, and grief is never finished. They're both true.
And it's been a real surprise to me, even though I've walked with lots of people in grief. But for myself, I was telling my therapist once, I just feel like I should be further along. He just kind of did what you're doing, shook his head and said, "Okay, if you were talking to somebody else who was in your shoes and they were telling you what you were sensating and feeling at this moment, I'd say, well, you're probably where you need to be right now." I said, "Oh, well, there's that."
Yeah, there's that.
It's just surprising. The deep griefs that we sometimes have will always stay with us, but sometimes we're looking for a way to get through it. Or society, somebody will say, "Well, shouldn't you be getting out more often?" Or "Why don't you move on?" Or that kind of stuff. Easy to say if you're not doing it. So.
Maybe
Okay.
you have to.
Don't like that sound.
Undo this thing.
Oh.
Try this one. Hang on, everybody.
This one?
Now. Okay, wait.
That's fine. All right.
Hang on, I got it.
That's fine.
Now you're ready. Oh,
That's
sorry.
fine. Leave them up
You
there.
got two.
Yeah, we don't want to lose them. The more significant the relationship, the deeper the wound, the longer the healing. I think it's vital to remember it can be a best friend, it can be a coworker, it does not just have to be a family member. But I think the significance of the relationship comes home when the death occurs. And just to acknowledge that we will always miss certain people in the unique role that they played in our lives. And in my life, after Carol died, a year later, her father died. That same year, my mother and a sister-in-law died. And so I had all of those together. And 2 years later, my dad died. So our family was all reinvented. But I was thinking each one of those had a different relationship with me. And I grieved in different ways. for my mom, when she died, it was on my birthday that I missed her
Mm,
because I didn't get the phone call that I
right.
was expecting, or the card or something. She would have acknowledged it. And so you get these things that have been a part of our lives that remind us, oh, that's changed forever. This is close to what Laura was saying. Getting over grief is impossible. Moving through grief is possible.
Yeah. And incorporating it into our lives, right? So instead of this idea that one day this won't be here,
Yeah.
no, it will always be here. How do you carry it in such a way that you still live a full, rich, wonderful life?
Yeah. It's like saying, when we get through the pandemic, then we'll, quote, get back to normal. We will all be telling stories about what happened in the pandemic, and it will be a part of who we are. In fact, right now, if I'm talking to somebody, we'll say, well, was that last year? No, it was before pandemic. That's how we mark things in our minds. But it's like we've lost a year, or 18 months. But we do move through it, and that means to incorporate is a good word, or to come to terms with it. Rituals create communities and offer shared comfort. Avoiding rituals robs us of needed companionships. I sometimes talk to people and say, oh, I never go to a funeral. Well, who are we trying to protect here? I just think we need it. And again, going to a funeral reminds me of my own mortality, which is one reason. It also reminds us, if you happen to see the body or pictures and all the stuff that go on in a memorial service, that things are different and they are gone. Oh, look, it worked. You may recognize that. That's been on your sidewalk. This one's important, I think, for people of faith community. Faith in God does not lessen the pain of loss. It does, however, provide direction, meaning, and hope. I think sometimes those of us who have a faith think, well, we have this bubble around us and we just won't feel it as strong. We'll be protected. We're human beings, and that does not change just because you have a faith life. It may for you, but it hasn't for me now, not so much. But I do think it's important. It's a source of direction, meaning, and hope for many of us, and does give us some kind of grounding that can help us. And often people that will journey with us, that not everyone gets.
It also gives us somebody else to be angry with. Faith in God means we've got God, and we can say, what the hell is going on? And then we can be reminded that, though it is a trite saying, that not everything happens for a reason. Some things happen, and God did the most God could do. But anger at God, I think, is a really, really normal response for someone who has faith in God, right? So the two things go together. It does provide direction, meaning, and hope, and there's this other.
That's a good point. And especially, I deal with people a lot who will tell me, well, I know we're not supposed to be angry with God. To which I'll say, who told you that?
Yeah, have you read the Psalms? There's a whole lot of anger at God going on in there.
Yeah. People that talk about lamenting Psalms say probably 60% or more of the Psalms have a lament in them. They're not hopeless.
No.
But they are this wrestling match. Okay, God, apparently you forgot this promise that you made.
Well, and what are you doing, God?
How long, oh Lord, how long? Significant dates will always remain significant and deserve to be honored in some way. Again, anniversaries, birthdays, the date of death, whatever makes it significant. I think it's important. It's also nice when others remember that. Oh, this is your anniversary. I hear people now that celebrate their 50th anniversary. I said, oh, that could have been us. There's things like that. People who lose a child are not regretful that other people have kids that are graduating, but they are mindful that they've been robbed of that. And it's okay to acknowledge that.
Which I think is a big note for those of us who are helping others who are grieving. There's some sort of fear in us that if we bring it up, it makes it worse or something. But the opposite is true, at least in my experience of most people, that they feel seen when you say, hey, isn't this the birthday, or isn't this, whatever it is, or it doesn't even have to be the significant date, just to, I know you had this loss and I'm thinking of you. This is hard. Like that. That's helpful instead of being something, You're not reminding them. They know.
Yeah. Some of the better caregivers I know will make a note of a date of death, and a year later they'll send a card.
Mhm.
I'm not that disciplined, but I wish I were. But it means a lot. It does. There is no fast forward button for getting through grief. If there were, I would have patented it, and I would. But they're just not. I think we wish there were a fast forward button, and sometimes others wish there were. Grievers are not the most fun people to be around when they're in the raw grief. And so sometimes we try to push them along a little. You do it the way that you're wired to do it, with others' help. I think this one's important. Keeping it together emotionally for the sake of others exacts an exorbitant price on a griever's emotional well-being. Sometimes we put on ourselves, oh, I've got to protect you from my grief. So right after Carol died, let's say I was at a worship service in the foyer, people say, well, how are you? I don't know how the hell to answer that question. Do you really want to know?
Right.
And how long do you have? And do I have it within me? And when you get asked 5 times, it's very hard. But more so in the family system, sometimes every family member reacts differently. And some people don't want to talk about it. They want to go silent for a while. Some, that's all they want to talk about. Some want to go to a movie to escape. So finding a way to do all that. But if you're the one that's experienced the main loss, it can be a real burden as to how to respond to others, and to try to protect them from who you really are.
Well, and protect yourself too. And there's a level of vulnerability of answering
That's right.
the how are you? I try, to not ask that question, but to say, I'm really glad to see you. I've been thinking about you. And then that lets them do what they want, but you've not actually asked how they're doing. Because I mean, they're bad, right? Like chances are good.
Yeah.
So, if that helps, I don't ask questions. I start with it. I'm so glad to see you.
Yeah, I learned that when I would walk into somebody and they'd have a tube coming out of every part of their body. I'd say, well, how are you? I'm thinking, that's a stupid question.
Yeah.
How do you think I am? Take a look. And the same with grievers. It's not a good question. Though I would have some people, close people, that say, how are you really?
Yeah.
And they meant it. And that's different. So.
That is different.
And the last one, I think this one's important. Being in grief is not being crazy. It just feels like it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times when you're in raw grief, you say, I'm doing this wrong. I must be doing it wrong. Everything's spinning out of control. I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sometimes good if you're with a griever to say, that's just the way it is. So.
Well, like the woman in the grocery store with the cloud, I don't know about how your November works, but my May, I start feeling like I've lost something.
Yeah.
Like I get out of the house and I've got everything I'm supposed to have. And I'm like, well, was I supposed to have a different kid with me? Do I have my keys? It's like I can't settle in, and it takes me a couple of days of that before I go, oh, I know what I've lost. It's my mother. She's not coming back. So here we go.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's open chat and see if anybody asked a question. Okay, well, raise your hand if you have a question or comment.
I think we scared them off.
I hope not. Beth, Ron.
I want to share 2 things. And one was a friend who lost his husband after a long struggle with cancer. And he said the hardest thing beyond his dealing with his own grief was other people starting out saying, oh, I'm really thinking a lot about you, and then spilling what happened to them. Yeah. It's an attempt to empathize, but Chris just really felt burdened by having to deal with other people telling him.
Yeah. Right. If you've ever been a deacon, you've heard me say, you are listening. You are not sharing your story. If it brings up a story for you, great. Write it down and tell me later.
Oh, yeah. But Laura, I know exactly how you feel.
Oh, don't do that. Thank you, Beth. That's good.
The other one was my friend Agnes that a couple of you met, my gardening friend Agnes, who was my mother's age. But she kept saying she was ready to go. Once she passed 80, I'm ready to go. I don't see the point of a long life and blah, blah, blah. And then she started talking specifically about her service. And she said, I don't want to have an open casket and having people come around and look at me and lie and say how good I look. A dead person doesn't look good, so don't do that to me. And then the other one was, and don't save your compliments or good thoughts about me until after I'm dead. If you have something to say, tell me while I'm living.
That's nice.
Yeah, very wise, very wise. Yes.
The casket thing makes me think of something we didn't talk about, which is traumatic grief. You know, sometimes the way a person dies can make that grief more complex, more complicated than other griefs might be. So there's not like a level of grief. That's not what I mean. But when my grandfather committed suicide, while that was not the same loss as my mother's death, it was harder than I think it might have been had he died of just natural causes.
Sure.
So there are, you know, car crashes, any sort of sudden death, in my experience, complicates the grief and just makes it, you know, complicated. There's got to be a better word for it.
You can be redundant. That's okay.
It makes it complicated.
The other side of that is a long-term debilitating illness is also hard.
It's true.
Because that takes a toll as well. And sometimes you think, will this ever end? I just want my life back. And then you feel guilty that you said that to yourself and you go right back to managing the crisis. So it really is. It depends on what all went on behind the death. So.
And I'm glad you brought up guilt, because that's, and then we'll look for hands again. But in my experience, the one thing everybody grieving has in common is guilt. And if there's nothing to feel guilty about, people will make up things to feel guilty about. There's always something we could have done or said or been, or always. Guilt is just part and parcel of grief, in my experience. Susan Wegner.
My mother died about 7 years ago, about this time of year. It was in the early days of July. I don't remember exactly, maybe July 3rd. And I happened to be in Minnesota when she had her stroke and went in the hospital. And so then it was clear that she didn't want any extra stuff done, you know, to keep her alive or anything like that. And so we just started moving through what she wanted. And then when she died, we put together a fairly creative memorial service. And through all of this, I did not feel any strong emotions. And I've always wondered if there was something wrong with me that I didn't. And still to this day, my sister-in-law said to me, now she had lost her mother, and she said, now it'll just come over you out of the blue sometime. It never has. I felt we did a pretty good job with the service and with dividing up all her things. It just has never overcome me, and I've just felt like maybe there's something wrong with me that nothing happened like that.
Nothing is wrong with you. So nothing's wrong with you. Everyone experiences grief differently, and especially in that story, Susan, that's the life cycle, right? A life well lived, goodbyes were said, the work and the ritual was all there. I mean, that, you know, that's beautiful. Nothing's wrong with you.
If she says so, I'm going to believe it. See, I trust her. I would say you probably started your grief when you got to talk, when she helped you talk through it. That's part of the grief too. You may not have even felt it strongly then, but you were given the gift of being able to communicate about it. Some people are robbed of that, are not given the chance or choose not to do it. So grief starts when you know the death is going to occur, however that shows up. So maybe that's part of it too. So, thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Liz, you're on mute, darling. Oh, you're still on mute. Let's see if we can unmute you. We can't unmute you.
I can't unmute you.
Oh, Liz, can you
Unmute,
yourself?
Liz.
I did. I had to do it twice. Okay. Seems to me we've lost quite a few seniors in our congregation. And Mary Lee and Sidney Burris I really, really miss them. So I saved their obituaries, and I have them though still on my refrigerator, which is my bulletin board. I think for most people that's true. And I'm thinking how comforting it is to see their photographs and to read their life histories again, and just to be able to remember them in detail like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Nice.
That's beautiful, Liz. And I think that you bring up something that's important, which is, objects that are comforting to us. I've got when I was installed at Covenant, Mary Lee presented me with a shawl, and I'm looking at it across the room in my office. And I could go a list. I have something from everybody. I have this card Roberta Stokes made for me that has the Covenant boat on it, and it says "Welcoming all aboard." And Nancy Henry turned it into a banner. But having things that remind us of the loved one and that give us comfort can be a real help in grieving, and can be a way to, if you're not the person actively grieving but you're trying to help someone, it can be a kind thing to do. My grandma, when my mother died, gave me a pillow my mother had made for my grandma, so it had my grandma's initials on it. And that was a real kind thing for her to have done.
Well, I hear there's going to be a worship service here.
Yeah.
Y'all better hurry if it's going to be at 10 o'clock.
It's at 11. Don't confuse people. It's at 11, everybody. 11.
So you don't have an excuse to be late. You've been given an extra hour. But thank you for letting us be a part of this today. I appreciate it. I hope you can join us the 17th, which is a Saturday, 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I do have one thing, though you wrapped it up nicely. I'm still going to say something else. So we talked about griefs and losses, but what about the ones that don't have an end date, right? That the ones we talked about coronavirus and all these other experiences that we've been having, that it's not over. Sorts of, the palette in many ways for me is a grief that just doesn't stop. I mean, there's no like, and here's the date. You don't have a death date. You don't have an end date. So what do you do about those? And Liz, can you mute yourself again? I don't know what, maybe something in your space that is, go back up.
There it is.
There we go. Thank you, Liz. David, I see your hand. Hang on one second. So if there's not a date, if we can't say, here's the death date of that loss.
Right.
I still, for me, and maybe you would have a different, I would give the same advice. I would still say, set a time aside every day for ritual, light a candle, give yourself space to feel the loss, to grieve, incorporate it into your day, give yourself the space to do it. So that, just if that helps. David Ramsey.
I was thinking about the timeline you were just talking about. My father died after 5 years of increasing frailty at 91, not a surprise, and a life well lived, with all of us standing around his bedside singing the 23rd Psalm. My brother, Danny, died very suddenly. None of us knew he was ill. And the middle brother, Danny was the little brother, but Danny's office staff in his medical practice called Bob and told him that Danny had died, and Bob called me. So the first time I knew there was anything wrong with Danny was my brother telling me, Danny died. And there's not an end date for that. I still think about my coming retirement and how much I was looking forward to going to his house and barbecuing, or going on hikes in the mountains, which we did several times. And so that's something that'll never get to one of those comfortable closures.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I mean, my experience is love never dies, and so grief never ends. It's never over. And, it's just never over.
Yeah.
So you learn to hold it. And it doesn't mean you don't still live a rich, full, beautiful life. And it's always there. Okay, friends. So if you're coming to church, just to reiterate, it's at 11. 11. And if not, you should be able to live stream also at 11. You got an email in your inbox. It's there now that will show you, give you a link. If you have trouble with that, do not contact me, but it's all explained on the website. Hopefully it'll work, and hopefully it'll be recorded. So that's what's happening. I'll see some of you at 11, and thanks for being on education, so not worship, education with us. And Bill, I wonder if there's a teaser for next week or